Well, hello everybody, and welcome to this last session of the day. This is going to be our first debate session of the conference, and we are going to debate the question of whether donor-backed investors in private enterprises should be monitored under the GPEDC Development Effectiveness Framework. Now, the Development Effectiveness Framework has long since been about more than aid, but in this particular session, we are going to concern ourselves with the use of public money, much of which may be aid, it may be scored as ODA, to invest in private enterprises. I imagine everybody in this room is well aware of the huge emphasis that has been placed on using ODA to leverage private investment and fill some of that titanic financing gap that there exists between existing resources and the estimated costs of attaining the SDGs. It may be that the rhetoric has run ahead of reality somewhat, at least in terms of the amount of money we're talking about. There isn't really any good data on the amount of ODA that's being invested in private enterprises at the moment, but I've heard the figure of 3% of the global aid budget mentioned anecdotally. But I think that in aid agencies across the world, political masters are instructing their aid agencies to find new ways of using aid to catalyze the private sector, so that 3% is only going to go up. So we're hoping for a lively debate. Our speakers are going to be held to a short opening statement, and then we'll open the debate to the floor. I'm going to aim for closing remarks from our speakers at 5 o'clock. Now, we want to know what you all think about this question. We will be conducting an online poll. So again, if you go to pigeonholelive.at in your browsers. Now, this is a question that deserves a bit of nuance. So you will actually have 4 answers to choose from there. Please don't select your answer until you've heard everything that everybody has to say in this debate. But it would be nice to get a feeling for how people in the room feel about this question at the moment. So ignoring nuance for now, if the question is, should donor-backed investments in private enterprises be monitored under the Development Effectiveness Framework, raise your hands if your answer to that is closer to yes than it is to no at the moment. Have a show of hands. Okay, not that many. Right. Well, the question is, should donor-backed investments in private enterprise be monitored under the Development Effectiveness Framework, under the Busan Principles? So again then, raise your hands if you're closer to yes on that than you are to no. Okay, a few more. All right, so without further ado, let me introduce our speakers and then away we go. This debate is going to be introduced by my colleague Catherine, who has recently joined us at ODI. She's a development finance specialist who has worked with the One Campaign and for the NGO Results UK, amongst others. I'm a bit reluctant to sort of pigeonhole the other 2 speakers as just crudely for and against the motion, but anyway, there it is. For the motion, Jesse, to my right, is the director of Eurodad, where he oversees everything from strategy to research and advocacy. He was previously with the Bretton Woods Project's ActionAid UK and has worked for DFID. Eurodad is a network of 47 civil society organisations, and they really do have a long track record of working on this topic. So if you haven't already, I encourage you to visit their website and take a look at their work. Neil Gregory, to my left, is the head of thought leadership at the IFC, the arm of the World Bank, which has been investing in private enterprises since 1956. Historically on what they would regard as non-concessional terms, but they now have a blended finance unit. And so I think this is a safe space. We can use the word subsidies. They're providing subsidies to private investment through their blended finance unit. Neil was previously the Chief of Strategy and Operations for the World Bank Group Financial and Private Sector Department, where I think that meant you were responsible for the Doing Business survey, and he has particular experience in South Asia. Okay, Catherine, you take the podium.
Thank you, Paddy. Right, coming up? Yeah. Okay, great. So I shall be very brief in my remarks, as I want to make sure the two debaters here get the chance to really give this a good debate. But we thought it would be useful before we launch into the debate itself, just to briefly sort of set the scene on this topic. And as Paddy alluded to, using public finance, whether it's ODA or other public finance, to subsidize or to invest in the private sector, it's nothing new. But we're seeing increasing enthusiasm in the international policy discourse, and it's certainly in donor practice as well, apparently, as far as we can tell, for this practice. And it's being thrown increasingly under the spotlight. So that's why we're looking at this issue today. And the question that we want to really dig into is, would it be feasible and would it be desirable for the Busan Development Effectiveness Framework to be applied to donor support that is channeled to private enterprises through institutions like development finance institutions? So what I'll just very briefly do is go through each of the 4 overarching Busan principles, and we'll consider whether or not they might be applicable. And I'd like to just throw open some questions to the 2 speakers that follow me to see where they stand on these issues. Oops. So just a quick bit of context to make sure everyone in the room is up to speed. So what do we mean when we say DFIs? So DFIs are institutions that support the private sector through various instruments, notably loans, equity investments, guarantees, and technical assistance. These are government-backed institutions, which means they're funded by development agencies, often in donor countries, and they're usually, not always, but they're usually majority owned by governments. They're also able to raise financing very competitively on the international capital markets, which they can then on-lend to their borrowers. We have both bilateral DFIs, the biggest ones are FMO in the Netherlands, CDC in the UK, and OPIC in the USA is another one. We also have multilateral DFIs. These include, most notably, the World Bank IFC, of which Neil will represent later, and of course the regional development banks as well, the African Development Bank, Asian Development Bank, and so on. So, as Paddy briefly alluded to earlier, in terms of actual hard data on the key issue of how much ODA is actually going into this kind of practice currently, we just don't really know. We don't have the data to be able to answer that question. We can look at to get a sense of it, we can look at the scale of annual operations of the DFIs. So a big one like the IFC is investing roughly $11 billion last year, and on top of that, immobilized an additional almost $8 billion from other partners. The European DFIs in 2015 collectively raised about $6.6 billion. So that's the kind of overall scale of it. Of course, the degree of ODA going into that mix is much smaller. And as Paddy said, based on sort of estimates that we can get to, we think it's somewhere in the region of 3 or 5% of ODA. But the key point is, what are the trends? So we hear a lot of enthusiastic talk about this. So while it might be quite a small number now, is this, in fact, likely to keep growing? And moves, for example, in the OECD DAC to redefine what ODA can and can't count for private sector instruments, or, suggest the fact that this trend might be one that's increasing in the future. And so it's probably quite helpful to realize as well that the DFIs themselves have various frameworks that they adhere to. So the third column there, the one that's multilateral development banks, common principles. So this is a document that was endorsed by the MDBs, which are one subset of the DFIs. These are the 5 principles that they think are most valuable and important in their operations. These are things like additionality, making sure they're bringing in new investments that wouldn't have otherwise happened, crowding in rather than crowding out other investors, commercial sustainability, reinforcing markets in the countries rather than skewing them or distorting them, and making sure they promote high standards in their clients, the usual kind of environmental, social governance type of stuff. And when we scan across to that first column there, the Busan principles, that I hope we are now all familiar with, perhaps ad nauseum after today's discussions, we can quite clearly see that there isn't actually much overlap or much synergy between the 2 different sets of principles. And that's not necessarily surprising. They're set up to do quite different things, potentially, or at least that's what we're here to debate, I guess. So, actually, I should go back. So, just to pick up in brief, to tick through these 4 Busan principles and whether or not DFI investments might be applicable. So, ownership, first of all, that first row in the first column. I mean, it rather depends in this context, I think, what we mean by the word ownership. So, in one very simple sense, the owners of a private sector firm do have ownership of that firm, and it's inherent in the process itself. All the owners have a stake in its success. But if we're talking actually about country ownership, then what some people are calling for is for DFIs to align more closely behind governments' national development strategies and plans, perhaps their industrial policy and so on. So 2 questions I'd like to throw out to the debaters on this are, is alignment to national strategies actually problematic for DFIs, particularly more than for any other kinds of traditional aid or other flows, given that national strategies are quite broad, and given that I think I've yet to come across a national development strategy that doesn't in some way call for boosting investment, boosting economic growth, boosting job creation in particular. And that usually figures pretty highly. So in that score, perhaps DFIs are, by their nature, aligning behind these. But also, if DFIs are just seen to be responding to market demands, they're not proposing the businesses, they're simply choosing which ones to invest in, then wouldn't a sort of smart industrial policy allow the DFIs to invest where the market dictates and see which businesses prosper and which don't, rather than the government necessarily fully controlling that? I think one point where we can agree is that DFI should be consulting with the government, and that they should do their best to support the development strategy, and certainly to avoid undermining it. But where there could be a particular role or not for something like the Global Partnership is perhaps up for debate. On the second point on results, I think it's probably helpful to separate the debate here into 2 linked parts. The first is what results are being targeted, and the second is what results are being measured and how. There's a lot of calls, I think, for DFIs to increasingly focus their operations on results around poverty and inequality, the more traditional development kind of focus of results. And yet, as we've discussed already, there can hardly be many national strategies that don't also prioritize job creation and investment. So perhaps this is more just a division of labor thing, where DFIs are targeting those bits of the results. And on the second point, in terms of how we measure them and how well DFIs are aligning to country results frameworks, it's interesting to note that in the 4th column, IFI's harmonized indicators, they've actually got together in 2013, the various IFIs, international finance institutions, and come up with their own list of indicators to harmonize across their organizations in what they're measuring, or the metrics they're using to measure the impact of their investments. And the most key one to point out is the first one, the number of employees, so job creation, basically. So do we think, actually, if DFIs are going about and measuring these kind of micro-level impacts for themselves, for their own investments, perhaps now that they've gone to this process of harmonizing this list, a useful way forward, rather than seeking to force them to align to country results frameworks, is rather to look at how the governments and the DFIs can work together and seek to better align both the country results frameworks and these IFI harmonized indicators that are already being measured. On the third point on inclusive partnerships, here we're sort of thinking mostly about issues, I think, around consultation with affected communities, the quality and accessibility of grievance and compensation procedures. Some of these issues just came up in the policy simulation exercise for those that were here then. And I'd just quite quickly like to point out this graphic, which came from a civil society research report earlier this year, which actually took a selection of DFIs and tried to assess how well they were doing against the Busan Development Effectiveness Principles based on these certain metrics. And we can quite clearly see that on the 2 that are relevant for partnerships, I would say the second one, participation, it's all reds. On the last one, the complaint mechanism, we've got a healthy dose of reds and oranges there, but we also have some greens or bluish greens, which suggests that perhaps there are best practices available that could be more widely shared between the DFIs themselves. But ultimately, I think the point is that these types of consultation and grievance procedures, they all cost money. So ultimately, it comes down to a trade-off. We can think of it simplistically as a kind of quantity-quality trade-off, if you like. So what I'd like to ask the 2 debaters is where they stand on this trade-off. assuming that you can't have sort of endless consultation, 100%, but where does that line need to be drawn? And should a body like the Global Partnership have a role in identifying and helping to frame that trade-off? And the last point, the fourth one, is around transparency and accountability. And in breach of us being a neutral scene setter, this is the one where I think from ODI's perspective, we would like to posit that perhaps on transparency, the Busan principles and indicators don't even go far enough for what we would like to see on DFIs. So the current setup, reporting your data to systems like IATI, the International Aid Transparency Initiative, or the creditor reporting system at the OECD, that doesn't really allow for lots of interesting fields of information that would be quite useful to know about DFI investments and ODA that's going into subsidizing those. And there are certain key pieces of information that we think that would be very useful to include to improve the transparency of this reporting. And that might be things like knowing who the real owners, the beneficial owners are of the companies involved, knowing whether or not the investments are conforming to open contracting standards, and actually particularly useful when we're talking about additionality and value for money with ODA, knowing what is the effective degree of subsidy, knowing how much ODA is actually going into these things, into the mix, into the blend, in the blended finance to facilitate these investments that wouldn't have otherwise happened. Without that key ingredient of information, we can't actually tell how much ODA is going into this, and we can't tell how effective or otherwise it is being. So just to conclude, the 4 questions that we would like to set out for our debaters, amongst others, are ownership. How does it really work in this area of private sector investments? And is the traditional concept of country or government ownership applicable at all for this kind of thing? Results, what are the results the DFI should be targeting if they're using ODA, and how should these be measured? On inclusive partnerships, where do you stand in this quantity-quality trade-off, if you do agree that there is one, and how could the global partnership play a useful role? And on transparency, do you agree with us that actually a lot more should and could be done on transparency to increase the amount of information that's available to the public about the nature and terms of these DFI deals that are using public financing?
All right. Thank you very much, Catherine. Jesse, up to you.
Thank you. Currently I've got 5 minutes, but I thought I might ask the chair if I could tell a quick anecdote before the clock starts. And the anecdote is that last week I went to a meeting at the OECD and something really strange happened to me. I became quite passionate and quite angry at a very technical OECD meeting. And the meeting was to discuss the change in the rules for what can count as ODA to include private sector instruments. And I became quite passionate because for me this is the biggest change to ODA rules in perhaps 40 years. And also the way the rules are presented at the first draft stage, to me, it is open to extremely wide interpretation. So, for example, the USA pointed out that they could risk blurring the line between ODA and export credits, which would be a major, for me, problem. So I became quite angry because these rules were being debated and we weren't allowed to see the documents, and the speed at which they were being debated seemed to exclude other stakeholders from the process. So I would totally encourage everybody to become familiar with this and to ask for more transparency, more time on that, and particularly also for us, if these rules get changed and there isn't a strong commitment to untie aid first, I think potentially the floodgates open and ODA as we know it could change dramatically. So I think it's important, and therefore it's very timely, you can start the clock now, Chair, that we have this debate. But first I just wanted to say what we're not talking about, and we're not talking about whether the private sector is important. We all agree it's extremely important in development. Let's put that to one side. What we're talking about is public or state intervention in the private sector, or more accurately, in financial markets. So we're talking, as Paddy said, about subsidies to companies. We're talking about guarantees for companies. So what is the best role for the state to play? But here specifically, if we're talking about ODA, we're talking about foreign public entities and foreign public money, which I think is really important to emphasize. So for me, I think it's pretty obvious when you think about the principles that they do, or they ought to apply. Maybe the specific monitoring needs to be updated, particularly if the DAC changes the rules on what's allowed. But we could start at results, and I think actually in many ways results is more important for this kind of investment than for traditional ODA, because I think there's a problem with the way the discussion on this topic is framed, which is about from billions to trillions, which is about leveraging more money. It's all about quantity. And actually, I think the debate should be about quality. What is the impact of the way public development banks, ODA is being used to support private investment? Just two thoughts there. For example, every private investment, of course, has mixed impacts. Some will benefit, some will disbenefit. So it's very important to know that, particularly in low-income countries where much of the foreign investment is in extractive industries, for example. Second, when you think about the ODA debate, there's going to be choice impacts or distributional impacts. So if we spend more ODA investing or subsidizing private companies, we're going to therefore spend less ODA in other areas, traditional public investments, for example. So there's always a choice to be made, and we should be clear about that. So results matter. What's the best use of ODA in, second point, the country-specific circumstances? So ownership is still, for me, the bedrock of all of these discussions about development effectiveness. And again, I think it's even more important when we're talking about interventions in the private sector, because what is it in any particular country that is holding back private sector investment or preventing the private sector from employing more people? It will vary enormously. And maybe it is about the financial sector. So maybe there isn't enough money, or maybe there aren't enough projects to invest in. But we can't assume that. It may also be that the infrastructure needs upgrading, or the workforce needs to be better educated. So there's always a choice to be made between, for example, subsidizing cheap loans to the private sector, or maybe investing in schools or health systems or infrastructure with public funds. And when we're talking about ODA, we're talking about a choice. So we should be making that choice, and we should be making that choice at the country level, and not because donors have suddenly decided that leveraging private finance is their number one priority and they want to shift their portfolio towards that. I think the other aspect of ownership, which is also not talked about enough in this discussion, is macroeconomic management, and because when we're talking about DFIs particularly, or I'd rather call them public development banks, international public development banks, we're talking about inflows of foreign capital, which can have, of course, impacts on your exchange rate. We're talking about potentially pro-cyclical impacts. So there's a lot of macroeconomic things for the government to worry about. And so I think it is really important that those decisions get made at the national level. So ownership, so results, ownership, more important perhaps here. So finally, transparency and accountability. And I totally agree with Catherine that this is where we need to make significant improvements. So I did some internet research. I looked at Swedfund, which is a Swedish international public development bank. And for each of their investments, you get a press release. Well, that's it. Then I looked at the IFC, which has slightly more information, but as has been pointed out, you don't get things like, for example, what's the term of the loan? Are there contingent liabilities attached? In fact, very much detail at all about what's happening. So most of these investments happen with virtually zero, I would say, transparency. But the impacts, of course, are only felt by people in developing countries. So here we have international institutions and ODA international money being spent or being used, and the people who are affected can't get any information that's valuable about that, and I think that has to stop. So I don't see why principles like results, ownership, transparency, and accountability shouldn't apply, and in fact, I think in many cases they ought to apply more if we're talking about using ODA to support private investment. Thanks.
And now Neil Gregory.
Thanks for the opportunity to participate in this discussion. Not surprisingly, I start from a slightly different place in thinking about this. To take a step back, there's really two big organizing principles for how things happen in a society. They can be organized by governments through some sort of collective coming together, some kind of representative government, or they can be self-organized by private citizens getting together and interacting amongst themselves. And when that happens in the context of markets, that's what private business is. And so I think the starting point has to be a recognition that private investment and private business has a legitimacy of its own and has market disciplines of its own which don't rely on government to bring to it. Sometimes I think that people who come from a government perspective, and I started my career in DFID, so I had this mindset at certain times in my career as well, look on the private sector as something instrumental. It's another tool for government to deliver on its program, its development priorities. I would suggest there's a different perspective, which say that markets and the private sector is a key way in which people in developing countries self-realize their goals and improve their income and escape from poverty. It's not a tool of government. It is people doing things for themselves completely separate from government. And so if you start from that perspective, I think you have to be very sort of humble and cautious about trying to interject government and bureaucracy and rulemaking into something which is basically a self-managed process by civil society. It may not be the way in which you're used to thinking about civil society. Maybe you think about non-profits and so on. But I would argue that for-profit firms are just as much part of civil society and have equal kind of legitimacy. And so when you think about things from this perspective, some of the Busan principles are actually reflected through the disciplines of the market rather than through some kind of government regulation. Firms are owned by shareholders who have a voice to the corporate governance of the firm. Consumers have a voice in what firms do through their market decisions and what they choose to buy and sell. Firms have to focus on results, otherwise they go out of business. If they're not delivering value to consumers, they won't make money, they won't be in existence. Firms have to maintain all kinds of relationships with their suppliers, with their employees, with their consumers. So business inherently has a lot of inclusiveness built into it. And the private business has its own frameworks for accountability. In most countries, there are accounting standards, there are requirements to report to government, to file company reports. You know, if you're listed on a stock exchange, you have additional reporting requirements. You have to report in tax forms and so on. So there is a whole separate framework for transparency and accountability that applies to private businesses. So I think we have to be very careful about trying to take something which was designed for government-to-government processes and applying it to a different part of the economy. That's not to say that the underlying ideas of trying to make sure that private business operates in a way that's transparent and adheres to good standards is not important, and that's why IFC, like other DFIs, does a lot in our work with investee companies to promote good accounting standards, good environmental and social and practices, and so on. But it needs to be put in a framework that works for private firms, not trying to fit them to a different framework which is meant for government-to-government relations. A couple more points I want to make in this short introduction. One is that, Jesse mentioned this agenda of billions to trillions, and I think that is an important agenda, that the scale of financing needed to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, whether it's $2 trillion a year or $3 trillion a year, there are different numbers out there. But clearly it's a whole different order of magnitude to official development assistance. What about $100 billion a year, or the total financing of the multilateral development banks? And so the use of donor money to leverage private sector is very important to get to the scale of financing you need to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And what that means, I think, is we have to be very cautious about thinking that the tail can wag the dog. If you're using maybe 5% of the financing of the project comes from support from a donor and the other 95% comes from private sources, then you have to be realistic about what that 5% can insist on. The whole framework and the whole package has to work for all of the people providing financing. So I think, again, you have to think very carefully when donors are working in these structures and trying to leverage private finance of what is realistic for them to ask for. And then one last point, because I think Jesse talked about this a little bit. Sometimes we think about the use of donor money as being about somehow subsidizing the cost of finance to private firms, and therefore you're somehow subsidizing a firm, and this doesn't seem to be a good use of public money. I think there's two reasons why this may not be the right way to think about what donor money is doing. First reason is we actually now live in a world of very low interest rates. So the days when the name of the game was about lowering interest rates, it's a different world that we live in now. And so really that is not what donor money is needed for. What donor money is needed for is to reduce the risk in transactions. That what private financiers are telling us when they say we can't invest in this fragile state or we can't invest in this low-income either country is not that, gee, if only the interest rate was a few basis points lower, then everything would be good. What they're saying is that the risks are just too high and we need to take some of the risks off the table. This is what the World Bank Group has been talking about with the IDA donors in terms of getting new IDA money to support IFC by de-risking our business in the fragile states and the lowest income countries. It's about taking certain risks off the table by a donor being able to take responsibility for that. It's not just about subsidizing interest rates. So I think there is a lot that one can do in terms of developing a disciplined approach to using blending of concessional and non-concessional money, and we very much support a disciplined approach. We don't want a race to the bottom where donors compete to give more subsidy than is needed. We want to make sure that the minimum subsidy or the minimum amount of concessionality is used to de-risk an investment to make it happen. For two reasons. One, because obviously you don't want to use subsidy where not needed, and secondly, because we want to avoid a backlash of people saying, oh, you know what, we tried this blending and it was misused and it wasn't well targeted, and so people may step back from that. We think it's vital to scale up and get from billions to trillions, that we're able to use some donor money in a disciplined way to leverage private money. So we're in favor of discipline, but it has to be discipline that is appropriate and designed around the way that private business operates, not something that's adapted from a government-to-government process. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I've been an extremely ineffective chair time-wise, so we'll push back the final remarks till 5:10 to give us a bit more time to hear from the floor. This is a debate, so you don't need to disguise your statements as questions in this context. You can just contribute to the debate. I would encourage you to think not just about how you think things should work and how donors should behave when they interact with the private sector, but also think a bit more pragmatically about how anything that you have in mind could be operationalized through something like the development effectiveness framework. It could be that anything you have in mind in practice would be ineffective if it was attempted to be implemented. So, just have that kind of constraint in mind. Okay, so let's go to the floor. Where are the mics? I'll start to the left and I'll move right. So let's go over there.